1 second. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first edition of Science Beyond the Sci-Fi. I'm your host, Tyler Yohe. I'm the writer and creator of the hard sci-fi used in the video game development for Broken Crown Games. For those of you that are new to the Science Beyond the Sci-Fi panel, what this is basically, it's not only our studio's way of vetting not only the possibility, but sometimes the plausibility of the science fiction that we use in our games. But we also use this as a way to spread the word about some of the science that is actually going on in modern scientific research today. So with that brief overview of the Science Beyond the Sci-Fi panels, this is our first episode, and today we're going to be discussing space exploration, past, present, and future. With that said, today our space exploration experts are Amy Teitel. She is a writer and blogger for Motherboard as well as Popular Science. Michael Paul, who is the mission director at Penn State Lunar Lions, and Micah Walter Range, who is the director of research and analysis for the Space Foundation. So with that, I'm actually going to let everyone kind of introduce themselves really quickly. So Amy, you mind starting us off?
Sure. Hi, I'm Amy, as I've been introduced. I am primarily a spaceflight historian and freelance writer. So for me, I guess what I bring to this is the past knowledge and the general sort of interest in how where we've been and what we've done informs where we can go next.
All right. Thank you, Amy. Welcome to the panel. And Michael, can you do the next introduction?
Sure. My name's Michael Paul, and I'm the mission director for Penn State's Lunar Lion Google Lunar X Prize team. We're a group of researchers and over 100 students who are working on building the first private robotic lander to send to the moon. I've worked on NASA missions in the past and bringing that expertise to a whole new way to do space exploration.
All right. Thank you, Michael. And last but not least, Micah, mind introducing yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Micah. I'm the Director of Research and Analysis for the Space Foundation. The Space Foundation is a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to advocating for the use of space and education about space. And in the research and analysis part of it, we study the space industry so that we can provide good information to lawmakers, corporate decision makers, the media, pretty much anyone who needs good information about space.
All right, thank you, Micah. And just real quick, I'm just going to go back through in that same order, but can you guys give a quick way to contact you, whether it be Twitter or maybe a website that they can find more information about your stuff? Amy?
You can find me on Twitter. My handle is ASTVintageSpace. VintageSpace is also the name of my blog, which is hosted at Popular Science right now. So if you Google Vintage Space, you'll find me, and from there you can kind of get to the other stuff that I do. But Twitter is probably the best.
All right, thank you, Amy. Michael?
Yeah, it's best to reach me through our team website at lunarlion.psu.edu. That's lunarlion, one word, .psu.edu, and through there you can find all of our connections to Facebook and Twitter, and follow along and see how the team's doing.
All right, and Micah?
I would say visit our website, spacefoundation.org, or you can reach the research team at research@spacefoundation.org.
All right, thanks everybody, and again, welcome to the panel. So I just want to start off, we'll kind of go from past to present and then to future. So with that said, Amy, since you are our space historian of the group, can you kind of tell us, one, how many landed missions there have been on other planetary bodies, both moons, planets, that kind of thing, and how many of them were manned versus unmanned?
Right. now that you phrase it that way, I don't know how many missions there have been, per se. We landed on the moon 6 times with manned missions, but there were a host of unmanned probes that land in advance of and since the Apollo missions of the 1960s and 70s. We've also, well, we didn't. We as humans did. The Soviet Union landed the Venera probes on Venus. We've landed, as most of us know, a ton of stuff on Mars. And we've also landed, well, we sort of landed on Jupiter, but Jupiter doesn't really have a surface to land on, so we shoved something into Jupiter. We've landed on Titan, of course, Saturn's moon Titan, and we've also landed on a couple of asteroids and comets. Eros and, I'm not going to pronounce this right, Itokawa, 2 asteroids, and Comet 9P sort of impacted that. So we've landed on 9 different bodies and done, again, I'm not sure the number of missions, but that's a whole lot of science and a whole lot of landing to have done on different bodies.
All right, and I apologize for the wording on that. And then just one thing I do want to mention, for those of you, again, that are new to this panel, this used to be a textual-based panel that was done in our forums. And if you would like to go back, Amy actually did write a little bit about the Huygens probe landing that happened on Saturn's moon of Titan. But other than that, Michael, if you could, I wanted to actually ask your opinion on something related to maybe incoming freshmen at Penn State, that kind of thing. I've actually read in the past that there's a huge misconception that people have as towards what's been done in the past with respect to space exploration. Apparently 1 in 6 kids believes that, has a misconception that the first person to step foot on the moon was actually Buzz Lightyear. And the other fun misconception that I've read about is actually the second leading misconception is that Lance Armstrong was the person who first stepped foot on the moon. So that's one thing that I was just incredibly surprised by. And I've also heard that, I'm not sure what age group this really goes up to, but apparently a lot of people, even some adults, believe that we have actually had manned missions to Mars at this point based on the images that are being sent back by rover missions, including Mars Curiosity. Have you kind of run into that when you were educating anyone?
I'm not surprised to hear some of the things that you've said. I didn't get to see any of the moon landings with human beings, making footprints on another body in the solar system. I was born a year after the last one, Apollo 17, right? And it's interesting to see how much kids, especially, can mix up what they see in the movies and what they see coming out of NASA. And the graphics are so good in both cases that it's kind of hard to see, the truth of it unless you actually sit down and study it. And I think the key is to really make it fun for kids to study it and to understand just how fun and challenging it is to build a spacecraft and to get it, from here to the moon, from here to Mars. And it's one of the things that I just took on was I'm not a doctor, I'm not a professor yet. They just asked me to start teaching a freshman seminar class. It's one credit. The kids come once a week for about an hour, and we're going to talk about the Lunar Lion mission, yes, but we're going to talk about actually exactly this: the past, present, and future of space exploration. I've been a part of, as I said, of missions like the Messenger mission to Mercury, and a somewhat unfortunate mission to a comet, the Contour mission, and a pair of solar observatories that are flying around the sun right now called Stereo. Those are NASA missions. I think NASA's here to stay, and everybody should believe that and support that. But there's so many new things happening that this class for these incoming freshmen is going to balance an overview of what's gone before, what's happening right now, and what I think can and should be happening in the future.
All right. Well, you actually mentioned about the NASA's here to stay. We should all know that and support it. With that said, for those that aren't in the space industry, people are seeing some of the sensationalized news about what's being done in the private sector. But obviously there is a lot of government work still going on, and very important government work. But could you tell us a little bit about the private space exploration that is starting to crop up for the first time, really becoming very prominent?
Sure. The Google Lunar X Prize is a great place to start. This was almost 8 years ago. A group got together and said, could we set up a technology incentive prize for the first private lander on the moon. And the whole point of this prize is to encourage and to incentivize private space exploration. Could a private entity actually land something on the moon? 8 years ago, SpaceX had barely launched anything. Virgin Galactic was still in the throes of getting itself together. These private space companies were still emerging and still hadn't quite crossed the believability threshold that they're at now. I mean, Virgin Galactic is on the verge of sending people into space, private individuals on their own, fully privately funded. And on the other hand, SpaceX has got billions of dollars in contracts with NASA and the Air Force and private companies to launch hardware into space for them. And so this is a reality now. I'd say that that what people should look for in private space exploration is not just stuff that's going out, but where people are actually making money in space. It's going to be a long time, not too long. We'll probably see this in our lifetimes. It's going to be a long time though before somebody really mines an asteroid and says, "Hey, we just made $1 billion off the platinum buried in a near-Earth asteroid." That's a really hard thing to do. It can be done, but it's really hard to do. And the business proposition of what it takes to fund that and how you're going to get a return on your investment is a little bit of a long game even now. But when people are making money in space today, you know that you're watching the genesis of this private space industry and something that we've all been waiting for and watching for decades.
All right, thank you. Micah, I mean, with your experience with the Space Foundation, obviously you kind of touch on both sides of things. You get the government perspective, you get the private sector perspective there at your nonprofit. So could you kind of give us a couple more ideas of what's going on in the private sector?
Absolutely. And it was interesting, Michael, what you were saying about making money in space. Right now, there is a lot of money being made from space. One of the things that the Space Foundation does is we put together a report each year, and here's the latest edition of it, called the Space Report. And we look at commercial revenues throughout the world, government spending throughout the world, and it's about a 3-to-1 ratio. Roughly $74 billion being spent by governments, but $240 billion in money being made by companies, delivering satellite television, communications, satellite imagery, commercial launch services, satellite manufacturing, things like that. So I would say there's a very healthy space industry that exists more or less independent of government activity. And so the question is, going forward, how do we take some of the lessons that have been learned from all of that and transfer it into activities like asteroid mining or research in orbit, maybe it's biomedical research or something like that. And there have been some very promising leads on that front. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that develops. And there's a lot of interest right now. So I think the future is bright on that front.
Previously, you were actually telling me something about FedEx getting involved in space, and I honestly just want to learn a little bit more about that while I've got you on here. Because that's just, I mean, we've got GoogleX, we've got SpaceX, now we've got FedEx dealing with space stuff. I just want to know how that's all tied in here.
Well, the letter X wasn't getting enough usage, so it's good to see that happening. Traditionally, you've had companies that would focus very much on space, or they would be maybe an aerospace company that had space as part of its business. Well, what we're seeing more and more are companies that normally have nothing to do with space, or that you wouldn't think of there being a connection, and they're trying to figure out how they can get a piece of the pie. So in the case of FedEx, they see this growing trend in CubeSats, so very small satellites, maybe just 10 inches across each side, and universities are putting them together. The military is putting them together. It's a good way to do quick research. If you build a sensor and you just put it up on a tiny satellite, see how it performs, then you can iterate very quickly on your design. So with this growth in CubeSats, there's an opportunity for a company like FedEx to get involved in doing all the logistics. here on Earth. So they have a space solutions office at FedEx where you can call them up and say, okay, I need these parts and they're very delicate, so please handle with care, or I need to get this satellite to launch facility and it needs to be climate controlled on the way. Whatever it is, you can call them up and they'll try to work with you, and they're now familiar with some of the things that people need on that front. And going forward, it would be really interesting, I think, with some of the suborbital flights. And this is something that I haven't heard too many people talking about. But if you could do same-day delivery across the world, that would be pretty cool. And I'm sure they would charge, I don't know, 10, 20, 100 times as much as they do for next-day delivery.
The Army tries to do that.
Astronomical fee. All right, I actually do want to get Amy. I want to bring you back into the conversation a little bit. I mean, Micah and Michael, thank you. But I mean, you guys are getting a little too far out into the future there with asteroid mining and everything. So let's bring it back to like 5-10 years in the future. So I'll direct this first question to you, Amy. Within that time frame, like the near future, as we move from present to future, is there any missions that in your history of going out, doing a lot of writing in the space industry, are there any missions that you're kind of excited to see to come to fruition?
My favorite upcoming mission that launched, I should know this off the top of my head, but I don't, the MAVEN mission, NASA's MAVEN mission to Mars. I think it launched in November, and I think it's getting there next September. So this is a really weird one, and unfortunately there's no camera, so it's not going to be a big, like, popular excitement one. But it's testing the atmosphere to sort of reverse engineer and understand why Mars has lost its atmosphere and why it's sort of this dry, arid, cold planet that we see now. So I've met a handful of the science team, and one of them described it as, you have a pot of boiling water and you take a ladle and you ladle out a bunch of the steam, and based on what you can learn from the steam, you have to figure out how much water was in the pot before it started boiling. So that's what they're doing on Mars, and that's really cool. So that's going to be a really interesting mission. That's sort of the big one that I'm looking forward to that hasn't happened. Well, it's happening, but hasn't happened yet. And of course, New Horizons to Pluto. I mean, that's pretty neat. Planet or dwarf planet, whatever the hell you want to call it, it's going to be really cool to get something dedicated into looking at these small bodies way out in the distant solar system. And that's coming up. That's next July.
All right, and just to throw this out there, and I'll ask this one directly to you, Amy. Again, some of our viewers might just be sci-fi nerds that just love the science fiction, but they don't know the science behind it. So can you kind of explain, I'm sure they understand the basics of it, but can you explain why, I mean, you knew this mission already launched, but why it's taking so long to get there and what's going on?
Yeah, speaking of people thinking that Lance Armstrong walked on the moon and stuff, there are always things that people don't seem to know about space, and people don't realize that Mars is on average 30 million miles away. So like it takes a really long time to get there. So in a video game you can sort of launch and get to Mars, but in reality, depending on how fast you launch and the trajectory that you take, you can sort of swing by Venus or swing by Earth and get gravity assist. But if you're just going, it takes about 2 years to get there. So there's a lot of like thumb twiddling and systems checkouts that have to happen. Like real spaceflight is awesome, but it's also really boring. There's a lot of downtime. And
I don't know why you gotta play video games. Don't blame video games.
I'm not blaming video games. I'm just video games get to skip all of the really boring, like, all right, and we have another 18 months of cruise, guys.
All right, I'll try to add some boring like flight time into a game here.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, while I work on that, Michael, can you just give us a little bit of where you see the privatization? Obviously, like you said, I'll ask Micah in a little bit about government side in the future, but Michael, can you kind of give where you see the next 5 to 10 years going with private organization of space travel?
Sure. What I see in the next 5 or 10 years is somebody is going to win the Google Lunar X Prize, and you should look to Central Pennsylvania for that. That'll be a real landmark in yeah, that's going to be a real landmark in space exploration. It's one thing for companies to work closely with the government or to have very immediate revenue streams like telecommunications to justify the expense of space. But when somebody starts sending the robots to the moon, to asteroids, that's going to be really exciting. There's a lot of money to be made from services that are enabled through space, like communications, like imaging, data collection, but making money from space is going to be really hard. And I think that the first customers of private companies that are sending missions to the moon and beyond are going to be governments, not necessarily NASA, not necessarily the European Space Agency, but there's a whole group of countries in the world that want to become spacefaring nations. They want to be doing space research. They want to be sending their people into space, who don't necessarily have the infrastructure or the capabilities to stand up their own space agency on the scale of NASA. And so there will be companies that are forming. There are companies that are forming now that are creating systems and creating plans for servicing these countries. So if you're one of these mid-sized countries and you want to send a scientific instrument to the moon, how are you going to do it? Is NASA going to give you a ride? Probably not. NASA's got its own priorities. It's got its trusted partners that it's using, and they do a lot of international outreach, but it's really hard to get on the waiting list for something like that. But if you're a small country and you can spend $5 million, $10 million on sending an instrument to the moon with your flag on it, that's something that you might consider doing. It's something that they are considering doing. And so what I think is really going to happen in commercial space in the next 10 years is that on the exploration side is that these mid-sized countries with mid-sized budgets are going to be paying private companies to help them get their hardware and their name and their country and their flag into space.
All right, and just to kind of add on to what you just said there, I know Micah's actually chomping at the bit based on what you said.
I'm sure he is.
Based on what we had talked about. But I will say, I mean, obviously, I'm sure there are some people in our audience that have already seen exactly what you're saying, have already taken place with SpaceX starting to partner with NASA to send stuff up to the International Space Station, like some of the supply missions and stuff like that. So obviously what you're talking about is something that's already happening, not just something that's in the future. So Micah, like I said, I know you're kind of chomping at the bit here based on what he said, so I'll kind of let you go to it.
Okay. On the commercial side or the government side?
Actually, both. I mean, I know based off what he said, you probably want to talk about the combination, but I know there's some countries out there that are kind of flying under the radar. They're not the typical superpowers of space like NASA has, or even the European Space Agency or Russia. So there's some other countries that are tiny and really trying to get a foothold in space, and between doing it themselves or working with private industry, they're finally at that cusp. So you mind kind of filling us in about that?
Sure. And just one thing actually about some of the countries that you would expect to be heavily involved in space. The United States obviously has a lot of missions going at the moment. Amy was talking about some of those. Russia, interestingly enough, has been a space power the whole time, obviously, but after the Soviet Union came apart, a lot of that got dialed back. So many of the science missions kind of went away, and it's only been in the past few years that the Russians have really started heavily investing again in things like astronomy missions or sending probes at a level that would correspond to their earlier days. Much of what they had been doing was more focused on human spaceflight, which is good because we need them to get us up to the International Space Station these days, and launching satellites for commercial customers all around the world. So we're seeing growth in Russia. China has a pretty ambitious program for building space stations. They've had an orbiting space laboratory for the past couple years now, and they've done a few missions there. So they're stepping out farther in terms of human space flight, and they have some big plans on that front. And they're also looking at the moon. They've had a couple missions there too, just robotic, not human. Japan's another one. Amy mentioned an asteroid mission that they conducted a couple years back. They have another one in the works. India is one that you probably wouldn't have expected to hear about an Indian Mars mission, but their Mangalyaan spacecraft was launched last year and should arrive at Mars later this year. So, they're very excited about that. That was their first big deep space exploration mission. And one of the trends that we've seen, particularly with these countries that may not be normally considered a major spacefaring power, is they often start off with just satellite imagery for their own country or telecommunications or something like that, and maybe they go and buy that satellite from some other country. But then as they grow and as they develop their own capabilities, they have a greater interest in exploration and trying to push the boundaries and do the science that they want to do. One really good example is South Korea. Just last year, they finally succeeded in launching their very own rocket. That was huge excitement that had a couple unsuccessful attempts in earlier years. But as soon as that happened, they came out with a plan for investing in more rockets, their own satellite manufacturing capability, and a lunar exploration program. And that's just a perfect example of how a country tends to move forward. So I think we're going to see that happening in more and more countries over the next few years.
All right. Actually, I'm going to slowly, for this last half an hour, start taking us away from reality and start putting us into sci-fi. So now we're in my realm. You guys should be scared right now. With that said, based on what you just said, Micah, one thing I do want to ask you is, do you believe that basically internal infrastructure for any country, not just like the superpowers, but like you said, a lot of the countries that are trying to get into it, South Korea, India, as every country starts to get a foothold in space, do you kind of feel that that internal infrastructure of government support through space and telecommunications, all that kind of stuff, do you guys all feel that that will remain the priority number one over space exploration? Like, Micah, you want to take that one first?
I think you're going to have a mixed portfolio at pretty much any time in the future. So one of the reasons that government remains involved is because exploration is both difficult and expensive. Taking the Google Lunar X Prize as an example, it was started years ago, but just last year, I think, they announced a series of milestone prizes because no one's reached the grand prize yet. No one's landed that rover on the moon, but companies are making, and organizations, not just companies, are making great progress. So how do you recognize that progress? How do you support it and keep it going? So, instituting milestone prizes is a good way to do that. I think we're also going to see governments doing that, and we have seen NASA doing that with respect to developing new launch capabilities in the commercial sector, where you say, here's the end goal, and what do we need to do to support it along the way? So I think you're going to find governments and companies working very much hand in hand and trying to figure out how do they support each other and how do the companies provide those additional services that maybe they can do a little bit better than the government, freeing the government up to focus on the extremely difficult and long-term planning and programs.
All right. Michael, I saw you actually unmuted yourself, so I'll let you talk if you have anything. Otherwise, I think Micah kind of covered a lot of it.
No, he gave a good answer there, and infrastructure is really expensive. The individual missions are expensive. These things are taking time to evolve. I mean, one bit of one measure that I look at is between when Kennedy said we're going to send people to the moon and bring them back safely, and those first footprints showed up on the moon, there was 9 years, less than 10 years, right? Between the first Space X Prize, the Ansari X Prize, and today, we have 10 years. And so the first human was put into suborbital flight on private dollars in the summer of 2004. And here we are 10 years later, and Virgin Galactic, building on that technology, still hasn't flown into space again yet. They've done some drop tests, they've done some powered flight tests, but their spacecraft 2, their spaceship 2, hasn't yet flown. And so the progress here is on a different kind of time scale than what we saw back in the 60s.
All right. I'm going to expand on my original question, and I'll let Amy finish it off, and then I'll go to the next question. So, Amy, again, I'm trying to pull everyone out of their comfort zone. So, let's say in the future, based on what Micah and Michael just said, if we are now a multi-planet society or a multi-planetary body society, so maybe we have a colony on the moon or a colony on Mars, could you foresee at any time, again, based on what Michael just said, of it's a different time scale, you have a lot of lead-up time that it takes to really build that infrastructure and get ready for these type of missions. If there was some kind of cataclysmic event, like there is in Broken Crown's universe, could you foresee us running into trouble where if all of a sudden every country around the world lost their military satellites, but we had a colony on Mars, which do you think would be priority number one for a country? Their military satellites and regaining their infrastructure, or supporting that really expensive colony on another planet?
I think definitely the military satellites. So that's my off-the-cuff answer. So I think just in terms of thinking about, I'm trying to think of this as realistically as possible, were we to do something like build an outpost on Mars, and it wasn't coming from that Dutch TV company that wants to do it like a reality TV show, so it's not private money, and you need, if you had government doing it, it would have to, that's so expensive and takes so much work and so many resources that I think the only way we would do it is if there was a threat coming at us that forced every government to cooperate and do it. So I think, I don't know, I didn't plan this when I started talking. I think I just can't even foresee a future where it would possibly be the case that we would have anyone caring about anything on Mars while there was still any military. Does that make sense? I kind of feel like if we're going to start doing the multiplanetary thing, we're going to stop having to have individual nations that are going to war, because this is the issue that nobody wants to fund anything in deep space because it's so expensive, when really we need more guns, and we need, I forget the statistic, but the U.S. Army spends more on air conditioning for troops than NASA has in a year, right? The way we allocate our resources doesn't favor these big space projects, so we'd have to sort of have a very different model of how our world works to see anything off-world, I think.
And that's kind of how I saw things when I started writing.
Caught up.
You actually kind of led that right where I was hoping. That's why I picked you. But that's kind of how I foresaw it when I was writing this. So going back to Michael, I feel like you have something to add to the topic, but I'll kind of lead you to a new question based on that. If a scenario were to happen that we had to choose, and I assume chances are most people would assume that we would pick the internal one, but like Amy said, before we would have to make that choice, ideally we would be at the point where we're not a world that's at war with each other. But Michael, since you are kind of involved in the private sector, and same thing with Micah, if either of you want to chime in on this, I think both of you would probably realize that there's plenty of missions right now that are ignoring the fact that we would have to get past the warring nation, and they're already trying to colonize Mars. So we've got SpaceX that predicts that they're going to do it by 2020 or something like that. There's the Paragon Space that has a orbit mission around Mars scheduled for 2018. Obviously Mars 1, like Amy spoke about. So do you think we'll be at a peaceful world scenario before we colonize our first planetary body, whether it be our moon, Mars, or anything? Michael, what do you think?
Okay, so are we going to make peace with ourselves before we really send anybody anywhere else?
Agreed. Yep.
Yeah. Is that yeah? Before I really had a clue who Neil deGrasse Tyson was, I read an article, an essay really that he wrote. It's probably 10 or more years old. He basically said there's 3 reasons why we do big things, and he talked about the Great Wall of China and the exploration with ships around the world where we found the Americas and so on, the pyramids, and he said it's basically religion, or war, or commerce, and these are the 3 reasons why we do enormous projects. And if you look at why we did Apollo, that was essentially war. That was posturing for war. But I don't know that Neil's entirely right about this. Well, I'm sorry, he's probably right. But I don't know that about those 3 things being the reasons. But he might not be right about why Apollo was done for war. Frank White wrote a book you might have heard of, The Overview Effect, where he talks about that sensation of being up high, looking down, and not seeing any boundaries between the countries. And you and I can see this from an airplane. The astronauts see this from space in a way that he says changes the way that they think. And in looking down and in describing the way that NASA operates, he talks about the astronaut as almost like the high priest, if you will, that one person that gets to go to the holy place, and the thousands of people that made spaceflight happen as all of the believers that put in their time, their effort, their money, and lifted one person up so that we could all understand this higher truth. And it's a pretty out there kind of idea to compare NASA to a religion. But if you're a humanist and you say, what is it that we should be doing? What is it that we should be doing that really changes the world, that makes all of us better? Then you might say that the private space flight is not going to necessarily happen for commercial reasons in the short term. Hopefully there won't be any war anywhere besides the dirt that we stand on that we're fighting. But maybe somewhere in this realm of commerce, some higher purpose can be served by doing exploration, and that we can come together around that. So there'll probably always be a little bit of war kicking around here on the Earth, but hopefully we'll be able to do these things before that very challenging, how do we stop fighting with each other thing gets overcome. I think you're muted there.
I am, thank you. Micah, I'm sure you want to jump in on this topic, but I want to jump to the next 2 questions. That way we can wrap up in time for Amy. So for the next question, in the narrative of the Broken Crown universe, there becomes a period called the Terra Boom Era, where obviously you guys all know what terraforming is. For those of you viewers that might not know, it's simply trying to turn other planets into an Earth. The Terra Boom Era is not necessarily that. It's more or less just coming to the point where we can put colonies on other planets, whether it be not necessarily terraforming them, but doing biodomes or underground dwellings, or somehow habitating other planetary bodies, moons, asteroids, all of that. So in the Terra Boom Era, basically it's this golden age where we're not just on Mars or we're not just on the moon, but it's really that exponential curve point where we've hit one, we've hit a second one, a third one, fourth one, and now we're just trying to explode. We're going everywhere. So that's what the Terra Boom Era is, when we really start to hit that explosion point of colonizing other planetary bodies. So I don't really want to debate when the first planet's going to be that will colonize, but when do you guys feel that point would be, a Terra Boom Era point? Is it 50 years in the future, 100 years in the future because we need more technology, or maybe 500 years in the future? Michael, you want to take that one first?
Micah or Michael?
Actually, I did say Michael, but I will go with Micah just because I didn't let him chime in on the last one.
Please, go ahead.
In that case, I would say more than 100 years. And part of the reason for that is the way research is being done right now, it tends to be very much focused on a particular setting or scenario. So, maybe someone's trying to, find a way to, well, both find and then extract water from the soil on the moon. There's research being done on that front. Same with Mars. How do you go to Mars, send something that will be able to generate oxygen or other things that you need? But it's very much focused on that one particular site. And that's partly because these places are so different. And if you just look at the solar system as a whole, you have so many different types of bodies, each with their own special circumstances, whether it's different gravity or atmosphere or temperatures, and you have to deal with all these different things. So someone either needs to come up with a really incredible biodome or multi-use technology, or you're going to have to keep on researching these things one at a time. And I think that's probably more likely just because of how the funding will work. It doesn't do you any good to develop oxygen extractors for all the planets in the solar system when nothing else has been developed for them yet. If there's no way to send people. So you're probably going to pick one, develop for that, and have your whole variety of things. So here's your oxygen, your water, your living quarters, all of that for the moon, or all of that for Mars. And then you'll move on.
All right, it's actually funny you say that. In our series, we have ebooks out right now. One of them is called Destination Titan. And in that one, we actually kind of address almost like having that ultimate playbook, like you said, of trying to cover all scenarios for all planets. It's kind of a can of worms where you have to do it one at a time, or have this perfect playbook, or have this perfect biodome that kind of covers all scenarios. And in our ebooks, we actually cover essentially what that playbook is, and this perfect biodome scenario. But I'll actually move on from that one. But the next thing in our narrative that I wanted to cover is the organization of a governmental body for space. Obviously, there's a few things that are already out there, but once we become a multi-planet society, I'm sure there's going to be issues of, well, what if something happens on Earth, like happens in our narrative, and all of a sudden there could be essentially atrocities where we have to abandon a colony or something like that. So eventually there's going to be a government that has to oversee all this. In our narrative, that government is called the Unified Planetary Body Oversight Council, or UPBOC for short. That kind of is the UN of solar system. And so it's really that oversight committee that makes sure everything is done properly, there's no human rights violations, that kind of thing. But they're also going, I wanted to make sure that it covered everything that could happen in a multi-planet society, which is kind of impossible. But one of the other things that comes into play is chronology. A lot of people, when they think science fiction, they don't really remember to take into account that each planet has a different orbit cycle around the sun, so therefore each planet has more days based on an Earth day. Then there's more days in each year for each planet. The days could be different lengths on each planet. If you're on a moon that's orbiting a planet, all of a sudden you're dealing with a completely different scenario than what we're used to. So to try to keep the entire solar system, since there's solar system-wide commerce, in our storyline, UPBOC creates its own calendar system. That way, everyone in the entire solar system has the same day length, time frames, same calendar length, all of that. So with that said, Amy, this last question before we get into the exiting stuff is aimed at you. Since you are a space historian, everyone kind of knows NASA blundered a few times in the past with kind of doing the conversions with metrics to imperial system. Have you ever heard or think there was any issues with maybe Mars sols versus Earth days, like any issues converting those or forgetting to convert those?
Not that I know of. So just in case anybody out there doesn't know, the issue, I think, was the Mars Polar Lander, that some of the units were in metric and some were in imperial, and it ended with the mission the lander just smashing into the surface and dying. So I think when it comes to sols and stuff, because I'm just trying to think, I think every mission except Curiosity has used some amount of solar power. So you have to have a pretty good sense of when your days are and when your nights are so that you can program things. And of course, it also has to, you got to think about like when you have a direct open line, and I mean that not literally, but like clear space in which you can try to communicate with your rover. So I think they're pretty careful about that kind of stuff. But you'd also think they'd be really careful about units of measurement. So I don't know that anybody's ever sort of had a sol-based mishap, but it could happen. I mean, yeah. Oh, you're still muted, Tyler.
Please grill JPL and find out for us.
See what I can get out of them.
All right. So that's all we really have time for. What I do want to do real quickly is, just in case some of our viewers, whether they're young kids or adults looking to possibly start getting involved more in the space industry, or just science industry in general, wanted to cover some ways that they could do that. So Amy, since I know you might need to jump off first, since you kind of have a unique perspective on the space industry, do you think you could give us some indirect methods that people could start to get associated with the space industry, whether it be writing or making video games, that kind of thing?
Well, yeah, poster child for how to do science without being a scientist, because I have no science background. But there are a lot of ways that you can get involved if it's just sort of doing, things on the publicity end of the sort of, animation and imaging end. There are ways that you can engage with things without having to be the one who's designing a mission or doing the actual hard science. And it's sort of, for me, I find, and this is what I tell anybody who ever asks about this, because I don't really know how else to put it, but like, if you have a passion for this and you really want to be involved, just follow that passion and you'll find something to do with it. So if you really, want to get involved in space in some way, just keep your eye out for those opportunities and the people who do it, and just, oh, do you need someone to write your newsletters? There's your in. So it's just sort of following your passion, finding a way to make it happen. So much easier said than done.
All right, that works. And just in case you do have to drop off before we get through everyone else, can you tell everyone one last time how to get a hold of you?
Yeah, best way to get a hold of me is probably on Twitter. It's AST Vintage Space, and from there you can find my blog is also called Vintage Space. It's hosted at Popular Science, and you can find all of my work from there and get in touch with me through that. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much for joining the panel, Amy.
Yes, thank you for having me, and it's very nice to meet you guys.
Likewise.
Bye.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. And Michael, for you, just a quick question about kind of how you could get involved on the space or on the educational side of things. Like if you were talking to a 10-year-old girl, or maybe even someone in high school, or maybe even college level, what would be your suggestion for getting involved from the educational side of things?
There are a lot of outlets. One that the X Prize Foundation promotes is called Moonbots, and I take a look at Moonbots online. You can form your own team and get into a challenge that is changes from year to year. Another one is called the Challenger Centers, and this is a center, a space science center for kids that was founded after the Challenger shuttle disaster by the families of the Challenger astronauts, and they have quite a few centers now around the country. I don't know how many, but there might be one near you. Check it out, and always know, and this is for all the kids that are watching this, and for all the kids that you can talk to, that science and math is much more fun than it is hard. And so just being diligent in pursuing those classes in school and in high school, and not taking no for an answer, they can pretty much do whatever they want, whether it's in science or not. Because as Amy said, we need writers and storytellers and filmmakers as well to share the word about what's going on in space.
All right. And then, Micah, I mean, the Space Foundation is great in that it kind of has a reach that's international. So for any international viewers that we may have, is there any way you could tell us either suggested places or things that people could do from an international standpoint to start to get involved?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, for one thing, if your company has a space agency or space program, definitely check it out, see what they have available. They may have opportunities for you to work with them or with industry partners. But beyond that, I would say there's a great deal of globalization going on, particularly in terms of engagement with the public. So there are space hackathons, there are space challenges. There's one that NASA supports called the International Space Apps Challenge. So, hey, it says international right in the title. And they have participants from all around the world who either come together or submit ideas. I think this year they had something like 8,000 or 9,000 participants from across the world. And the idea is that you come up with new ideas, new technologies, new applications. So maybe you have a great idea for how to combine satellite imagery with Twitter to figure out, during a disaster, when people are sending out their tweets, can you map that? Can you show where the flooding is? Can you combine these things to help the rescue effort? Well, that's just one example. There's another one that came out, I think, of last year's competition related to solar power. So, how do you use satellite imagery to figure out the best locations to have solar panels, and what is your return on the investment going to be? So I would say if you have an idea, there's definitely a way to get it out there and promote it, and potentially bring it to someone who can implement that idea. And if you just want additional help in terms of finding out where that avenue might be, would certainly be happy to point you in the right direction. So research at spacefoundation.org.
All right, thank you very much. With that said, that pretty much wraps up everything for this panel. If you're watching us on YouTube, please give us a thumbs up, help us spread the message. Other than that, you can check out more about our science fiction for the Broken Crown universe at www.brokencrowngames.com. And we are on Twitter, Google+, Facebook, all of that's on our website, so please check us out. Thanks a lot.
So long.
Thanks, Tyler.